us right now to weigh in is former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs under President George W. Bush and former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nicolas Burns. Ambassador, good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
How do you see all of this? Do you think China fully is on board with helping the U.S. with this North Korean threat? What's your take?
Maria, I think it's positive that Xi Jinping and President Trump appear to have formed a relationship. There may be some trust there from Mar-a-Lago in the phone call the other night. Clearly, China's central here because China supplies the energy, the coal, and the food to North Korea, so it has leverage. I think the Chinese do not want to see Kim Jong-un provoke a crisis. They're frustrated with him. But, Maria, I also think there's a limit. The Chinese also don't want to see North Korea dissolve because they don't want to see a united Korean peninsula with a democratic republic based in Seoul aligned with us, the United States. So President Trump's right to pressure the Chinese. I'm just not sure the Chinese will give him more than they gave President George W. Bush or President Barack Obama in the past.
That's an interesting takeaway because they don't want full change in North Korea, China, is what you're saying.
That's right, because, you know, in one scenario, if there's lots of pressure from the Chinese on North Korea, if there is ever any kind of insurrection in North Korea, there'd be a tremendous refugee flow from North Korea into China. And the North Koreans don't want to see a democratic government in South Korea right up on their border because we're aligned militarily with South Korea. So I think President Trump's doing the right thing here. He's practicing very effective diplomacy over the last week with Xi Jinping, but I just think there may be a limit on what's possible. And, you know, President Trump's been saying to the Chinese, this is partly your responsibility, and he's right to do that. President Obama said the same thing, President Bush. We'll just have to see how this plays out, because I do think you're right in what you said at the beginning. This is probably the most serious threat to the United States. North Korea could have a nuclear weapon that could reach our west coast of the United States in the next 3 to 5 years. That's unacceptable for Americans to have to put up with that kind of threat.
Yeah. Ambassador, what's your sense of the stability of the North Korean regime right now? Do they have a particular end goal in mind of something that they want? Do they just want nuclear chaos? How much can China really influence them, and how uncontrollable is the regime? How stable is it?
You know, it's probably the most isolated, as you know, the most isolated government in the world. It's a family-run dictatorship. There's been 3 of them since the late 1940s. Almost a mafia dictatorship of one family in North Korea. They're highly repressive. They're probably the world's greatest violator of the human rights and religious rights of their own people. And I think President Trump, you know, what we're watching here, Maria, is President Trump is shifting towards China, away from his campaign rhetoric, and he's shifting against Russia. There was a remarkable press conference yesterday with the NATO Secretary General where President Trump came out in support of NATO. Secretary Tillerson had a tough meeting with Putin, and frankly, I think this is the right balance. We need China to stabilize North Korea, and we ought to be containing the Russians in Eastern Europe.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Tillerson met for nearly 2 hours with Russian President Vladimir Putin. No sign that the meeting eased any of the rising tensions, but listen to what Tillerson and President Trump had to say about the relationship yesterday.
The current state of U.S.-Russia relations is at a low point. There is a low level of trust between our 2 countries.
Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all. We may be at an all-time low in terms of relationship with Russia.
So it looked tense between Tillerson and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, but where do you think the relationship goes from here? What was your takeaway?
You know, I think the Trump administration did the right thing here. This was a very stiff message by Rex Tillerson in what he said publicly and apparently what he said in the meeting with Vladimir Putin, and it was from President Trump as well. The Russians have intervened in Ukraine. They've divided that country. They've annexed Crimea. They've been bombing civilians in Syria. They're aligned with Assad, who is, as President Trump said, you know, a major violator of human rights. And the Russians interfered in our elections. That's what our intelligence community thinks. The FBI is investigating that. So I actually think this is the right policy. And we've got support from the Europeans and the Canadians. We've got support for the whole world in standing up to the Russians. But in a pragmatic sort of way, you also need China to be cooperative in East Asia. So I think the Trump administration is recentering itself. It may be, Maria, that these more pragmatic voices in the White House, like General McMaster, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, maybe they have more weight right now than someone like Steve Bannon, and in my view, that would be a good thing. These are very impressive people, Mattis, Tillerson, and McMaster.
Yeah, it's an incredible team. What about the NATO meeting? The president met with the Secretary General of NATO. He reiterated his call on member nations to pay their fair share for defense. He also added in at the press conference that he no longer considers NATO obsolete. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm a former ambassador to NATO, not the UN, actually. I was at NATO, and I believe in the alliance. All of our presidents, Republicans and Democrats, have always felt that the alliance is important, NATO, because it's the great power differential between the U.S. and Russia. Russia has no allies. We have 28 allies. And so for President Trump to say it's no longer obsolete, he said it's a great alliance. He did say that NATO had not been fighting terrorism, which is not correct. NATO's been in Afghanistan since 2003. And so I think this shift towards NATO, very positive for the United States and the Trump administration.
Yeah, real quick, Robert.
Ambassador, can you just comment a little about Syria? What do you think would be the next steps for the Trump administration on what may be the best possible strategy?
I supported the airstrikes, but now we need a comprehensive policy, and I think that the administration will be right to push the Russians and the Iranians towards some kind of negotiation that, and this may take years, to end this war. 500,000 people dead, 12 million homeless.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way we should push, and obviously continue to fight the Islamic State as our military's been doing.
And they said that is the priority. Ambassador, I want to get your thoughts on this. Listen to what President Trump told me about the moment that he actually broke the news to the president of China when he was with him at Mar-a-Lago that the U.S. had fired missiles at a Syrian air base. It's pretty incredible. I want to get your reaction.
I was sitting at the table. We had finished dinner. We're now having dessert. And we had the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake that you've ever seen. And President Xi was enjoying it. I said, Mr. President, let me explain something to you. This is during dessert. We've just fired 59 missiles. The military has been cut back and depleted so badly by the past administration and by the war in Iraq, which was another disaster. So what happens is, I said, we've just launched 59 missiles heading to Iraq. And I wanted you to know this. Now, he's eating his cake, and he was silent.
To Syria.
Yes, heading toward Syria. In other words, we've just launched 59 missiles heading toward Syria.
The chocolate cake diplomacy, Ambassador, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it must have been quite a dinner and quite a dessert. I mean, you can imagine the conversation. These are the two most powerful people in the world. And frankly, I thought it was to the credit of the United States that President Trump moved so quickly. I think that must have surprised the Chinese. And he moved so quickly last week. We backed up our commitments to defend civilians against chemical weapons, which is in the American tradition. And we'll see how it goes with the Chinese. They're going to be a tough foe for us. We have a lot of disagreements with them.